Kyle, let's try something different with this intro. You have 10 seconds.
On today's episode, we're interviewing David Epstein. He is the author of my favorite book, Range, but he also just launched a new book called Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. Kayla, how'd I do?
I thought that was a pretty good constraint.
I think so too, and that's exactly what we're going to talk to David about, the power of constraints and why you actually need more of them in your life. Let's get into it. David Epstein is the author of the New York Times bestseller Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and The Sports Gene. He was previously a science and investigative reporter at ProPublica, and prior to that was a senior sports writer at Sports Illustrated, where, fun fact, he co-authored the story that revealed Yankees third baseman Alex Rodriguez used steroids. Alex Rodriguez now partial owner of the Minnesota Timberwolves, so shout out Timberwolves. But kids, don't do steroids. David, very fascinating backstory if you keep going in on David. But today we're going to talk about his recently released book, Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. David, thank you so much for joining the show. And I forgot to mention this up top, but we are going to limit you to a constraint. You're going to have to answer all of our questions in haikus.
Oh, that could be tricky. I'm up for trying.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I already ruined it.
Damn, all right. Well,
No, you did it. That was it.
That was
good.
I can't even keep track of what is a haiku, apparently, so
That was great.
I think you're
You know
actually
what?
going to have some free reign.
I'm extremely impressed.
Yeah.
That was really fun.
Very excited to have you on the show, David. And this book is incredible. I have to get it out of the way that we talk about Range all the time on this show because it has radically changed my life. I think Kayla's sick of me talking about it.
Yep, we get in spats because it's like every single thing. I actually have the answer to this, and it's Range.
Well, don't suppress it. Let the man speak.
Yeah, exactly.
About
so right. You're
my
so
book.
right.
But I'm glad for Kayla's sake we won't talk much about Range today because
We will mention.
we're going to talk about the new book, and it's all about the power of constraints. I want to start with the story you have in the book of General Magic.
Yeah.
This is a high-flying 1990s tech company. They have basically unlimited money. They have the best talent in the world. They have this grand visionary plan, and the company ultimately is an utter flop. Yeah. They release one product. I think it sells 3,000 units, most to friends and family. And the diagnosis is they died by too much freedom and too much money, which are two things I would never say no to more of. Well, now after maybe reading your book, I would. But how did General Magic fail, and how does this kind of open up this dialogue around constraints?
Yeah, so the company, like you said, starting basically late 80s and then early 90s, has the absolute vision of the future, right? It's founded by 3 former Apple employees, 2 of whom designed the original Mac, and then one of whom whose job at Apple was seeing the future of technology, this guy Mark Peratt. And it's crazy. Like in reporting, I read his PhD dissertation from 1976 at Stanford. On the first page, he coins the term information economy.
Wow.
And he describes with unbelievable accuracy what's coming over the next half century. Not just the promise of technology, but challenges with misinformation and rising inequality and all these things. And in 1989, he draws in a notebook a thin glass rectangle with no protruding buttons, just a touchscreen with rectangular apps on it, and labels it remote-a-phone pewter. He called it the pocket crystal, right? There's no internet at the time. Mm-hmm. So he sees what's coming. Money pours in. Goldman Sachs takes the company public in the first so-called concept IPO, right? With an idea, not a product.
Yep.
And they can do anything. And so they do anything. Like every idea for something that might be cool that someone has, they build it. And it gets bigger and bigger. They add more people and they pour more resources in. And eventually it becomes so incoherent. So they're missing deadlines and all these things. And when they finally do put out a product, a personal communicator, nobody really understands it. Like it's not solving anyone's problem, and it's a complete flop. You know, the company 2 years after its stock price doubling on IPO disappears. And I interviewed maybe 40 former General Magic employees, and I'd say 3/4 of them said some version of, I just couldn't figure out what not to do. Mm-hmm. They could do anything. So they did do anything. There was actually one kind of emblematic interview. I don't know if I should go into it in more length,
sure.
But with this engineer named Steve Perlman at General Magic, who was one of his jobs was writing a calendar function for this.
Yeah, I literally have this written down. This is my next question.
Okay,
That's perfect.
all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Do you want to ask it? So
No, tell me the story, and then I'll follow up with the question.
Okay, and so he's supposed to write a calendar app. He writes it to go from 1904 to 2096 and checks it in, thinks he's done, and then one of the team leaders comes to him and says, Steve, somebody might write historical apps. You have to make this thing go back farther. So he writes it to go from year 1 into the future. Fine, checks it in, thinks he's done. And then another team comes to him and says, Steve, why are you starting with this arbitrary religious context of year 1? You should make this thing go back to the beginning of astronomical time. So he opens it up again, and that's how he ends up writing a calendar app that goes from the Big Bang, like way into the future. And if he'd stuck with 1904 to 2096, it would have been 4 lines of code.
Yep.
And instead it goes on for months. They had the talent, they had the resources, so they could always do stuff like this. And that's what always happened. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, when I read that passage, I literally, all I wrote was just a bunch of exclamation points next to it. I was like written speechless. It was just so shocking to me. And also at the same time, I've been in situations where I've seen projects that do this exactly, where the solution is good enough, but people think they need to make it perfect or they think they need to make it great. And so it spirals out of control. I guess from a work context, like when do you not arbitrarily, but where do you artificially place constraints when they might not exist organically?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few components to that question. One thing that you're identifying is humans have what's called additive bias. And its cousin, which is called subtraction neglect bias, which is we are hardwired to always add things to try to solve problems. Like apparently in our evolutionary history, having too much of stuff wasn't that much of a problem, but having too little was. So we're wired to always just add more and more and more and more and more. So it feels good when you're putting more into a project. But I think you need to do a few things. One, prioritize ruthlessly, especially early on. So to give a sort of illustrative example, one of the people that came out of General Magic was a guy named Tony Fadell. He was one of the young employees there who was kind of scarred, by the experience and became a zealot for constraints. When I first called him, he was like, I said, I want to talk about constraints. If you don't have constraints, make up constraints. He's like almost yelling at me on that. He's very enthusiastic in general. And so he went on to co-found the smart thermostat company Nest. And there he forced the team to work inside a literal box where he made them prototype the packaging before they made the product, because he said, this will force us to clarify our priorities. What are we really trying to communicate to the end user here? And if we can't fit it on this box, it must not be a priority. That doesn't mean we can't ever do it, but we're not doing it now. And so I think having those kinds of exercises that slow you down, as he said, these ultra constraint-based things, they slow you down, but they force that thinking. And I think you need these forcing functions that require you to clarify your priorities ruthlessly. So for me, for a book, that's a 1-page structural outline that I use for the book. Some other examples that I saw were systems where people would, or teams would, at work, visualize all their current commitments. That could be Post-its on a wall. And usually what happens is people see there's way too many priorities, and they have to move some things out of the funnel and implement rules, like one called stop starting, start finishing, where you can't start a new thing until you're done with a thing currently in progress. That helps you limit the amount of stuff you'll add on. So all these kinds of limits that force you to clarify priorities, I think, are important for individuals and groups at work. And
so something I hear often in the workplace, many people do, is if we only had more time, we could have made this work. If we only had a little more money, this could work. People are fighting. My team needs more bandwidth. Like, let us hire more people. It's getting to maybe this bias that we have, which is adding things is going to help.
Yeah.
How should you respond to someone if you're a CEO, an executive, a manager, and someone comes to you and says, I need more? Do I point them at the book and say, actually, no, you don't? How should we handle that conversation?
Yes, point them at the book directly to the link for sale and make them leave a review. So I think there are a few things. One is we can look at sort of what often happens, right? There are these case studies of when people have too many resources, but there are also sort of known things like in software development, for example. There's something called Brooks's Law, named after a computer scientist named Fred Brooks. And Brooks's Law is that when a project is already late, adding more people will make it even more late. Because it turns out that we underestimate the complexity that we'll introduce when we add more people. Of course it's going to get done more quickly. But that turns out not to be the case because you make it more and more complex. And there's all these costs of communication and all these things. So pointing to some of these things that are very well known in some areas of work to say, look, we're underestimating complexity. And some organizations will actually start to measure the time it takes for a new team member to have an impact as proof to show, look how long it actually takes. to get this person assimilated and all these things and try to keep things much more simple. Or I just literally today got a message from a member of the innovation team at Amazon who said, I'm so interested in this message because I'm constantly getting people saying we need more time, we need more resources and all these things. And they don't get it. What ends up happening is they don't say no to anything. When they get more time and more resources, they just end up with more competing priorities and nothing gets finished. So he was saying this is why we have this incredible frugality, even though we have all the resources in the world, that's enforced on us. And it's not that it isn't painful, but it's because it forces you to do that important thinking.
Yeah, you could say Fred Brooks told us we can't bring more headcount.
That's right. And he's a legend, right?
Yes.
He led the development of the operating system that first put humans on the moon. So you can say Fred. He's got Fred.
Well, I love it. In your book, you have a small footnote about the law on him, and it says only bring on more people if the task can be evenly divided and they can do it without communication.
That's right.
And that is a really good check for thinking about, do we need more headcount? Is that true? If not, the solve might be an additional constraint or something else as opposed to bringing on additional people. I want to ask you a question about General Magic before we move on to other topics, which is, I understand in some ways, well, in pretty much most ways, it was a commercial failure.
Yeah.
But then you hear about what came out of General Magic. You listed, we had people that went to Apple and changed the future. I think Sony, Adobe, it was like this hotbed of people who went on to change the world. So commercially, failure, I believe that. It feels, though, like it might have been the best R&D environment of all time. Is there a difference when you're thinking about constraints from we need a product perspective versus that expiration time actually sounded very beneficial for people who then went on to have constraints and change the world?
Yeah, in that sense, I actually think General Magic was a big success, right? It devastated people and companies who'd invested in it, and it definitely ruined some lives because of the way it came down. But the people that came out of it, like you said, especially some of the younger people who it was this formative lesson for them. They made eBay, co-founded LinkedIn, Nest, the iPod, the iPhone, Google Maps, Android, things that all of us use every single day.
Thing.
That's right. So that's where I was going with Bell Labs, right? Yeah. So Bell Labs had this combination where Bell Labs was the R&D arm for AT&T, and it's widely known for people that study innovation history as the most innovative lab that has ever existed. I mean, it was a corporate research lab, but their research led to 10 Nobel Prizes, right? From the creation of transistors that enabled the digital age to the discovery of the cosmic microwave background, which is not something you would think, the remnants of the Big Bang, not something you think, oh yeah, phone company.
Right.
And they had this really interesting mix where sometimes when they're sort of caricatured in a way where it's just it was total freedom. You could do whatever you wanted. And in fact, there was a huge amount of freedom for exploration, but they had a whole team that was sometimes bigger than the research team itself, whose job was to go out in the field, find problems that were worth working on, define them really carefully, and then bring them to these scientists and say, here's you can choose, but work on one of these. So they would help them define a problem. So as one scholar who studied this used this great phrase, long leash, narrow fence. Said, we're helping them define a problem, but then they have a lot of leeway. So I think getting that balance where we want a huge amount of exploration, but really problem defining. And General Magic, they didn't understand what problem they were trying to solve for people. They defined their customer as Joe Sixpack. And after a few years of missed deadlines, they turned around and realized nobody met the guy. Nobody knew who Joe Sixpack was. And so they ended up just building for each other, not for a real user. And so I think having that sort of problem definition. So in a sense, I think it was successful because of the lessons that people took out of it. But as a company in itself, it was obviously disastrous.
Yeah, I really am fascinated by the whole General Magic. And I think maybe the difference between Bell Labs and General Magic there is that one team. It's the General Magic individuals ended up creating stuff because of doing things differently than they did it at General Magic. So maybe that's a difference there. Throughout the book, I was thinking a lot about timing and constraints. And I think that there's, this idea that constraints make things better. They allow you to be more creative with rules. But is there ever any instances where removing the constraints after they've been, enacted for a certain amount of time can also be beneficial?
Oh, I think so for sure. And I should say, like, there's obviously such a thing as too much constraint, right? The word is practically synonymous with something that's frustrating, but that's why I thought this was an interesting topic to take on, is when is that not the case? And I think there are, so let me give you a specific example. One of the early readers of this book was a guy named Ed Hoffman, who was the chief knowledge officer at NASA. It's kind of like a head psychologist. And when he's reading it, he said, I have to tell you about this mission called L-Cross, where the engineers ended up with half the time and budget that they expected to have. So what did they do? Well, they whined and complained at first. And then what? And then they said, well, if we were going to get this done anyway, how would we get it done? And they said, the only way we can get it done is by borrowing technology. Like, we can't invent all the stuff. So they took imaging equipment straight from Army tanks and engine temperature sensors straight out of NASCAR and built a probe that confirmed water on the moon. And what this did was it attuned them to this idea of borrowing more technology. So in subsequent missions, when they didn't have quite those same restrictions of time and money, they still continued that practice of borrowing technology because they realized how useful it could be. So that was a case where I think you developed a sort of practice under constraints, and then even when some of those were removed, they stayed, at least for a while. Although I do think there's drift, right, where it disappears. But
it's very interesting. I think I see this in professional life where someone who has worked at a company where they had to be very scrappy. They didn't have unlimited resources, unlimited time, not small budget.
Speaking of, I mean, a place that had to start as scrappy.
That's right. That's right. Like, you learn how to be impactful with constraints. Then you see, like, people will go on to their next job. They might have massive success. You talk to them, they're like, it still matters. Like, you still have to have constraints. We're not going to overspend just to overspend. You have to learn that diligence. And so having this formative constraint experience, I think, does last your lifetime. And it adds value, even if the constraint then is removed after.
No, I totally agree. And it's interesting, like, when you think about people that started in a scrappy way, like Morning Brew, which started in a scrappy... Was Morning Brew originally bootstrapped? I think it...
Yeah. I mean, there was a PDF that Alex would send around.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, if more resources were always better, giant companies would never get disrupted. And giant companies are always getting disrupted. In fact, they're getting... Their lifespans are much shorter, at least in like the S&P 500, are much shorter than they used to be because they're getting disrupted more and more and more. And the only advantage that these smaller operations have are useful constraints and lower communication costs, basically. Yeah. And so I think especially kind of founders will often learn that lesson and take it with them.
And we'll be right back after this. Okay, back to the show.
Do you feel like... You say that the big companies have more resources, which is obvious, but also in the startup world, there is this fixation on fundraising announcements and raising a ton of money, which in some cases I've seen it really help companies, and in some cases not so much. Does that matter? Like, after writing this book, are you like, actually, we should fund these companies less because giving them more is setting them up to fail?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the venture capitalist Bill Gurley, who's famous for like early investments in Uber and Zillow and all these things, told me that there's a saying in venture: more startups die of indigestion than starvation, meaning too much, not too little.
Yep.
Now, is that statistically true? The ones that get zero funding are not counted in that denominator. So I don't know for sure. But I think it early on, it makes a lot of sense to enforce that discipline. And again, I think the two of the main buckets that useful constraints, I think, help with are forcing you to clarify priorities and launching you into productive exploration that you wouldn't do otherwise. And because of the way our brains are made, like, our brains are not made for thinking. They're made for preventing you from having to think whenever possible because thinking is energetically costly. So you just go for convenience. We don't do those things unless we're forced to. So essentially, you need to be in a situation where you're forced to.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I want to move on to the section in your book called Target the Bottleneck. You mentioned that. And the theory of constraints.
Yeah.
And what really stood out to me in that chapter is it kind of led down this path of that attention is the bottleneck for most knowledge workers.
Yeah.
And I think this is extremely relevant for listeners. If you work in the knowledge economy, you kind of are paid to think.
Yes.
And you just said we actually don't want to think. It's energetically costly. You think about all of the distractions that exist in the workplace now.
Yeah.
Like your phone is rings, pings. We've said weapons of mass distraction before.
Kyle
like
loves that
they're
phrase.
they're in your pocket all the time.
Good phrase.
And like it feels like that actually is the bottleneck now. That is like you need to build a constraint that like fixes that.
Yeah.
If I'm coming to David Epstein, expert on constraints, and I'm a knowledge worker, how am I scaffolding or building my day to remove that specific obstacle?
Yeah, I think this is a crucial question, right? There's one thinker whose work runs throughout the book, a guy named Herbert Simon, a Nobel laureate and founder of cognitive psychology, and he has this great quote saying, over 70 years ago, basically, saying, in an information society, what becomes scarce when information is rich? Well, the thing that information consumes. And what does information consume? Attention. So we might end up being in an attention-scarce society, and I think that has happened. So I totally overhauled the way I structure my workday from the research that went into this book. So, and a lot of this was learning about the work of a psychologist named Gloria Mark, who studies people at work. And when she started about 25 years ago, people were switching tasks about every 3 minutes. Then by 2012, it was about every 75 seconds. By 2022, it was every 45 seconds.
Wow.
And she found the average worker in an office checks email 77 different times a day. That's not 77 emails, 77 different checks. Mm-hmm. And the number of different toggles predicts, in a bad way, your end-of-day productivity and now your stress, right? She started measuring heart rate variability. And so we know it makes you more stressful the more you toggle. And your brain's like a whiteboard, and every time you toggle, you erase, but there's a residue that interferes with the next thing and it builds up over the day. So what you really want to do is reduce the number of toggles. And one way to do that is by batching some of your work. So let's say you need to answer whatever that volume of email is. Can you put that into 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 blocks where you're just doing email and then you're just not doing email when you're doing the next thing? Because the average is someone is doing 77 mini blocks, and that's what you don't want. Anything you can do to cut down your toggles, and it's painful at first, right? Because we're so phone addicted, basically, that if you put your phone outside the room, so it's shown that the presence of a phone will reduce your performance on cognitive tests. We don't always need to use all of our cognitive capacity, but when you do, so you can put it out of the room, that's better. But what Professor Mark found is that once we become accustomed to a certain cadence of distraction, we will, even if we get rid of the phone or whatever else it is, we will self-interrupt with intrusive thoughts at the rate to which we've become accustomed, as if there's some internal distraction barometer. And so it takes a little while to retrain your attention using blocks of work. Maybe start with a half hour where you're just doing that one task for a half hour, then take a little break to refresh, and then move into the next block. And the more you can carve your day up into sets of monotasking, where you're doing that one thing at a time, the higher your productivity will be, the lower your error rates will be, and the lower your stress will be. The problem is at first, because you're not doing all that toggling, you feel like you're not being as productive, but it's not the case.
The whiteboard imagery is one I haven't heard and is striking. The idea that every time you wipe it's clean, there's a little bit of residue left. At the end of the day, let me tell you, there's scratches all over my whiteboard. I'm exhausted, and it makes sense. I've got to retrain.
And then you need to sleep to clear the whiteboard again.
So speaking of distractions, let's talk a little bit about AI.
Yes.
Which obviously is very top of mind for everybody. It's a revolutionary tech. It does feel like it's removing a lot of bottlenecks when you maybe needed to hire a graphic designer before. Now you may have one in your pocket. That's fine, or gets to 80% of the way. You can do so much more, and it feels like anyone can do anything. But based on your findings from the book, it feels like maybe AI is just general magic in your pocket. So will AI make us worse?
Interesting. I think because I got interested in AI and wanted to be able to talk about it, for the last year I spent a lot of time with one particular, this isn't so much something I was writing about, but with one AI company that helps other companies implement AI. And one of my main observations from that is that it has never been easier to do too much than it is right now. So most of the companies were saying we need AI, and they're implementing it all over the place in this very sprawling way, really rapidly. And it leads to what researchers are now starting to call work slop, where it's like this.
We're very familiar.
We're very familiar.
Kayla's a bit of an expert in work slop.
It's this incredible volume of stuff that's like maybe it's connected to strategy, maybe it's just this huge volume, and it's allowing people to avoid doing the hard work of figuring out what you should not be doing in the first place. Starting huge because starting stuff is like frictionless now. Starting huge amounts of things without being very discerning. The organizations that were doing better, I think, and in some cases individuals, were defining the problem. What is the thing I'm trying to do? How do I match the tool to that? One company I saw even made, they did what they called mapping the jobs to be done. They made a map of all the different jobs in their organization and said, which of these can we fit a tool to in service of the larger strategy? So they're doing this harder work first, where they're thinking first and then turning to the tool. So I think there's tremendous promise. I think the danger is that we sort of use it the way we use GPS, where like you default to relying on it and then you don't know where you're going, right? And you can, it's so easy to rely on, and it can give you such the illusion of productivity. But we know from looking at productivity stats right now, it is not matching the rate of implementation. Maybe that will change, but I think we're in for a lot more work slop now. So we have to be careful about using our brains first and defining what it is we want this thing to do.
Yeah, it feels like maybe we have to create the packaging for the nest before we start using the AI.
Tony's main advice that he gives anyone trying to start something now, whether that's a book author, because he gave it to me, or an entrepreneur, whatever it is, he says, or even someone just starting out in a first job with ideas about how it should go, is write the press release right now, for what it's going to look like in 2 years. Because he says that forces you to say, what are the important things here? What problem do I think I'm solving? What value do I think I'm adding? And so I ended up doing that for the book, and it's a really useful exercise. It's annoying because to try to think that far ahead and make it concrete, and things are going to change, right? And you can go back and you can alter it, but that makes it clear that you sort of see these trade-offs. So I think having that kind of bounding box is really important.
It's very interesting, and I think Amazon did something very similar, where for every new product they would write the press release first and work backwards from that. I want to talk about creativity, which feels like the antithesis of constraints, but after reading your book, you actually learn that they're very intimately tied. And I want to make this about Morning Brew for a second. On the fourth floor, we sit a lot of the business people sit on the fourth floor. Third floor, where we're at now, a lot of the creatives. I think if you ask someone on the fourth floor, like, could you go down and be as creative as the third floor people? They would freak out. It would make them very nervous. Like, no, like that, I'm not creative. Like, I can't do that. And I think that's a feeling a lot of people have. Like, when you say be creative or like tell a joke without a constraint is like the worst thing you've ever heard in your life.
Right.
Yeah. Your mind goes blank. In your book, you talk about the green eggs and ham effect, which I think is this unlock of how you can actually be creative by using constraints. What is the green eggs and ham effect, and how can people use constraints to be more creative?
Yeah, that's a term that a psychologist gave to the repeated finding in research that restricting people's means makes them more creative, like instantly. And it's named after a famous bet, where a publisher named Bennett Cerf bet a guy named Theodore Geisel that he couldn't write a book using only 50 words. Theodore Geisel, a.k.a. Dr. Seuss. Yep. And he did it, and that was Green Eggs and Ham, and changed children's literature. And it forced him, that restriction, to experiment with rhythm in all these ways. And he ended up with this rollicking story because he couldn't be expansive with vocabulary. And the reason the psychologist put a name on that is because it shows up all over the place in psychology, where probably the single greatest creative prompt you can give someone would be something like, whatever it is they're trying to do, write a poem, make a picture, do the thing that comes to mind, and then cross that out and say you're not allowed to do that. Taking away from them the convenient solution, because when you have an open canvas, our brains go down what's called the path of least resistance, right? Just going for convenience. It's like you have cookies on your browser, and that's where your brain is going, to the place it's gone a million times. And so the only way to actually do something new is to take that away, basically. So I think anybody can kind of use this. Like, let's say you're going into a client meeting or something. if we weren't allowed to propose the usual thing, what would we propose instead?
Yep.
I'm not saying you have to do that, but that exercise is the engine for coming up with creative ideas.
I think it's so powerful, just the idea that it's not maybe a formula, but there is a thing you can do to increase the odds that you can come up with something creative. It's just about deploying that.
Yeah.
And it kind of de-risks this like big feeling of, I need to be creative. There's so many different options. Oh my God, what am I going to do? Well, if you apply a constraint, it again narrows that problem space, and then you can be creative inside of that fence.
Absolutely. And even picking something small if you have to. So this is, there was an international survey of psychologists about known creativity myths, so things we know from research aren't true. And the most popular one was that people are most creative when they are most free. The other most popular one was that brainstorming is the best way to come up with ideas, but that's a whole other thing. But anything, if you anything you can do to limit that open canvas, like if you're, let's say someone asks you to come up with something, an idea that would improve human health. Pick one thing. Pick nutrition. Pick exercise. Like just pick one thing to bite off. It will take you other places through what's called idea linking. But the best way to start is with something really, really narrow. So maybe even more narrow, like, improving eye health or something like that. Mm-hmm. And you'll get to other places. But to get going in a creative direction, you want to start as narrowly as possible.
Yeah, I think this is interesting, and maybe not to push back, but to think through some of the examples that you provided when you're talking about constraints and creativity is, for example, there was a famous pianist who was upset that the piano was out of tune and was not very good, and ended up creating the best-selling piano album of all time because they had to improvise with certain keys not available to them.
Yeah.
But they were an expert pianist first. Mm-hmm. And then the constraints allowed them to apply their knowledge, their expertise in novel ways.
Yeah.
So what is the relationship that expertise and creativity and constraints have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was Keith Jarrett in this famous thing called the Cologne Concert. And I think, working toward a mastery of craft is super important. I think, I have all kinds of feelings about how one gets to mastery that I was like writing about in Range and things like that. But in fact, mastery is also a double-edged sword, because as is knowledge, right? It teaches you some things you can do, but kind of prevents you from doing other things. And historically, innovators will use what some psychologists call preclude constraints, where they'll build up their mastery, and while they're doing that, they'll start to understand kind of the status quo of operation in their field, like what's the normal thing to do. And then most people will keep doing that, and that can be sufficient and great. But the ones that really want to innovate will define that thing and then block it, like use that preclude constraint. And so in this case, this was something that was foisted upon this individual. Without the mastery that he had, it would have been useless, right? He would have just been banging on a piano. But once he had that mastery, being forced to use a different kind of tool took him somewhere that he never could have imagined in advance. And so I think that combination can be really useful. And sometimes we don't realize, as we become more and more competent, I mean, this happened to me in writing, where when I became really competent at one point and was doing investigative writing, I started relying on a certain style of writing that I didn't even think about. And I was very competent at it, but it became so natural, but it was not so good for book writing. And I ended up like taking a beginner's fiction writing course that just impressed, where I was forced to write stories using no dialogue. That was one of the constraints. And it just knocked me into sort of a new level of writing. So sometimes even as we're developing competence, because it feels so good to do the thing that you're already competent in, you actually have to force yourself to get out of that.
And this is so interesting because it feels like there's now maybe two types of constraints: self-imposed constraints that actually prevent you from, achieving something interesting, and then these forced constraints that make you kind of break out of these preconceived notions of what you can and should achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope, I think sometimes there are differences between self-imposed or externally imposed constraints, but overall I kind of hope, what I was hoping for with the book is that it will be an emotional reframe for constraints more generally, whether they're imposed on you or not. Now, not all constraints are good, of course. And some, it really depends how you use them. So deadlines, obvious constraint. Deadlines can actually be really good or quite bad for people's creativity and problem solving. And the main point of importance is whether it leads people to start multitasking to try to make the deadline, or leads them to be more focused and monotasking to make the deadline. So there's also some devil in the details of how do you use the constraints.
This book it reminded me a lot of stress and how a lot of people view stress as negative. It's kind of neutral. It's how you deploy stress, and there's an optimal amount of stress to achieve the optimal result. Very similar to constraints. Not good or bad. A tool, when used appropriately, will help you actually achieve things that feel a little counterintuitive to the constraint itself. I want to talk about Herbert Simon for just 1 second.
Love talking about
and namely, maximizing versus satisficing, which to me is one of the most interesting concepts I've ever heard of. And I want to relate it to people's professional career, where I feel like most people's advice is you want to gain a lot of experience, so you should bop around. You should always keep your options open because there's someone else that might pay you a little more money, and you don't want to get too tied to a single source of employment. You also maybe want to start a side hustle, because what happens if you lose your main job? Now you have the side thing. It feels like you should always have unlimited options, and that's a lot of career advice. Do you believe in that advice, or should people actually be committing more based on Herbert Simon's research?
I think it's really important to gain a diversity of skills and experiences earlier in your career. I mean, there's a mountain of research, a lot of which went into my last book, about why that helps people build these general mental models that they can then use to do what psychologists call transfer, which is take skills and knowledge and solve new problems in a world where work doesn't look the same from one year to the next. Super important. That said, I think it's often the case, kind of especially among people who are hardworking and competent, that they can fall into this pattern where they're preserving optionality for the sake of preserving optionality. Right? And early on, that makes a lot of sense. But as you continue making choices just to keep your options open, you don't want that to become the end, right? And Simon, who is one of the most brilliant thinkers of the 20th century, I mean, he won the highest awards in computer science. He co-created the first AI demonstration. He was one of the founders of cognitive psychology, meaning like not therapy, but how our brains solve problems. And then he won the Nobel Prize in economics. And satisficing was one of his important concepts. So this is a word, a portmanteau or a mashup of satisfy and suffice. And what it means is setting good enough rules for your decisions instead of looking for the best all the time or trying to optimize or keeping your options open in case something better is coming along. And what Simon said is, in fact, humans do not conform to the models that economists make of humans, where we make rational choices and all this stuff. We actually just have to have mental shortcuts to get through life. And what he argued is that we should set good enough criteria for our decisions for everything. And then once you meet that, go with it and don't look back. So he had, he always had one beret, one type of socks he wore. He said you need 3 pairs of clothing, one on your body, one in the closet ready to wear, one in the wash. He ate the same breakfast, lived in the same house for 46 years. Like, you might say this was an unambitious guy if he hadn't won the highest awards in 3 different disciplines. Right. And what he said is this saves your cognitive bandwidth for things that actually matter. And building on his work, researchers started studying where people are in this spectrum of satisficing to maximizing. We might call optimizing now, trying to make the best of all your decisions. And it turns out that it's almost always bad to be a maximizer. So this is, if you're always, wondering, should you have picked another thing, having FOMO. Maximizers are less happy with their decisions. They're more prone to regret. They're less happy with their lives. They're much more likely to opt for reversible decisions, which actually prevents them from committing one way or the other just for the reversibility. And so I think and I have maximizing tendencies for sure. So I think it's incumbent upon us now, especially in this world where endless comparison is so possible. So maximizing tendencies are on the rise, especially the part of it that's called socially prescribed perfectionism, where you're always thinking about, should I have actually done this other thing?
So interesting.
And so I think we need to set good enough rules and even practices in your life where you do something that's good enough. For me, that's a newsletter. This won't make anybody want to read my newsletter, but for me, it's a satisficing exercise where if a book has to be a 9 or a 10, a newsletter, say if I get to 6.5, send it. And that's a really important satisficing exercise for me, and I think everybody needs them.
I love it. Your newsletter is quite good.
I was about to say, as somebody who reads it, I love it. It's,
6.5, so maybe
I'd have no idea that it was
a very strong 6.5.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it goes past that, but if I know I've hit 6.5,
you're good.
It's good. Yeah. There's one more thing in Simon that I thought was really interesting. I think it was called Fredkin's
paradox,
which applies so much to work, where the choices that are very similar to each other, you spend a lot of time debating, like what shade blue should this button be?
Yeah.
They're so close that you feel like, okay, now we have to really get in the details and figure it out. It doesn't fucking matter. Like they're all blue. The big choices that are like very different, what strategy should we pursue to maximize value over the next 5 years, those you don't actually focus on because the choices are so different.
That's right.
And those are the more important questions. So we're almost biased to think about the least important stuff. I think that's a really strong reminder to like check this paradox out every day because you're probably focused on the wrong things because of it.
That's right. Spending time on Fredkin's paradox, we spend the most time on the least important decisions, specifically because we're having trouble telling between the options. So you're like, so you have to agonize about it, but that also means it just doesn't matter that much. So we're not wired to spend the most time on the most important decisions.
Which is a very scary fact to hear a lot.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that we do in modern work, I mean, all of this kind of spending our days thinking about symbols and abstract ideas and visions of things that don't exist yet, this is very unusual in human history. This is a new thing. And so it's no surprise that a lot of things about us are not built for this. Sustained focus throughout the course of the day. And so I think we have to learn about how we think and put structures in place that help us.
Yeah, very, very interesting. All right, David, we have a final question for you. And we talked about how we're both such big fans of range.
Such big fans.
Kaila
Truly. Yes.
And I think you've alluded to a lot of this in the conversation already of how these books are more like intimately tied maybe than first meets the eye. But I want you to maybe walk us through what I'm calling the David Epstein universal theory of everything. Like, how would you take what you've learned in range and take what you've learned with your new book, Inside the Box? How do those layer on to each other in kind of a unified view of how people develop skills and mastery and don't get distracted?
Yeah, I mean, Inside the Box is very much responsive to the most common reader questions I was getting from Range, which were, I've built this broad experiences, broad network, broad skills. Now what? Or I'm really curious, but I'm having trouble deciding what to do. And I put myself in that boat also. So we know that in a fast-changing, complex work world, it's really important for people to have a broad toolbox. But being broadly curious and having all these options about what you can do also makes it difficult to decide what to do and how to focus that into achievement. So to me, this was the natural next step of once you've got that broad toolbox, you have a sense of your interests and abilities, where you fit in the world. How do you actually draw borders around that to propel yourself? And there's a hefty dose of me-search in this book. I've been terrible in the past at drawing boundaries around my own work. So very much I was writing the book that I need because I fall into that same pattern where I've been a zigzagger. I'm incredibly curious, and it makes it very hard for me to decide what to do and then how to execute.
In kind of in a perfect way, like read the books in order. And kind of model your life in that order. It's like exploration, pick up a lot of skills, and then figure out the right constraints to take you to the next level.
I mean, there's a deep body of research in what's called the explore-exploit trade-off. And that's what this is, right? You want to toggle between this exploration phases where you're seeing what's possible, you're learning about yourself, you're gaining skills, and then finding a project where you exploit that. And basically the way you build a good career is toggling between explore and exploit. So I have the Explore book and the Exploit book.
Yeah, but not toggling in a way that leaves residue on your whiteboard.
Not toggling within a single day. I didn't mean it that way.
and make sure to get some sleep to wipe the whiteboard clean. Okay, David, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a lovely conversation.
Yeah.
Congrats on the book. Everyone go buy it. It is a remarkable read. And if you haven't read Range yet, read that too. Thanks for joining us.
I'm a brew reader, as you know. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
Should we roll the credits?
Let's do it.
Our producer is Michaela Heck.
Our technical director is Uchenna Ogo.
Brittany DeTaco is our sound engineer.
And our president is Devin Emery.
This show is a production of Morning Brew.
Thanks for listening, and we'll have constraints for you next week.